If the pastor is seeing God's vision for the church, this is the person who's seeing the financial vision for the church. How do we come alongside that vision and make it happen?
Yeah.
And it needs to be someone who's got an objective viewpoint with some financial expertise that can step back and say, does this stuff even make sense in view of where we're trying to go?
Yeah.
And just be right next to the pastor, hand in hand, arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder, and say, I think this is where we need to go with that. I think if you do it right, Frank, it'll be one of the greatest blessings you've had in your organization. Hello, church leader friends. Jim Shepard here with my good friend, the amazing Frank Beeler, live from
the Creator House in Florida.
Orlando, Florida.
Yeah, Orlando, Florida.
With our friends from Sweetfish Media here.
Yeah.
What a cool place
So
to
great.
record, right?
Yeah, I love coming down here
It's
to
great.
record. Yeah,
We get focused. We're away from the action, and
that's right.
we
The
can-
quality goes way up.
Goes way up.
And
That's a
hopefully,
relative term.
yeah,
Me
that's
and you,
relative.
but
Yeah,
that's- we're from here to here.
Yeah, way up is from a level 1 to level
Yeah,
2 out of 10. But it's still
remember, Frank, we're well into this, and we haven't been
canceled.
That's
Yes, great.
Yes, whatever that looks like when you have a podcast.
I know that was a bar that you were like, I don't know how long we're going to make it, but we're going to do our best.
Yeah. Our family is
great.
still watching, so that counts for something.
Exactly right.
Maybe,
Yeah, okay.
maybe.
My wife hasn't listened to the last couple. I don't know about yours. She's like, I've heard all this before.
Mine hasn't said either way,
okay.
so because we're not sure.
I was sharing with somebody the other day that I was surprised they didn't know about the podcast, somebody that's in our world and circle. And they got super excited and they were downloading it and processing it. And the next day sent a text and we're like, hey, this was really good. I enjoyed this. So far, every comment that I've received, I've only received positive, so that's good.
I have to.
But every comment I've received have been all about your content. So nothing, no one has said anything about anything good that I've done, but they sure love you, Jim.
Well, I haven't received those necessarily. What I have received a lot of is you and Frank have this amazing rapport with each other.
That's true.
And that's really what started this whole thing, is that you and I had built this rapport in my office in all these one-on-one conversations.
Yeah.
And so, and several of them are people who have done podcasts, and they're like, that's hard to do. And I'm like, well, we already had it when we started, so it was just a matter of turning on the camera.
Right.
And neither one of us are afraid of the camera. It doesn't bother us.
Absolutely right.
We don't even notice that it's in
We
there.
don't even act
despite
like
the
it's
fact
there.
It's right there.
It's right there and there and there. We're a little surrounded. That's so good. Well, hey, today, very practical episode. I think you'll lend a lot of wisdom to this one. I think it'll be clarifying. And this may be one of those episodes that a lot of people end up finding that they share with somebody else that they know is in this particular role. What I'd love to do is pick your brain on the role of the CFO in the church. My experience has been when, I don't know what the job descriptions say, but when I'm interacting with various CFOs, it's literally everything from a bookkeeper role to really an executive pastor role that includes finance and a little bit of everything in between. Sometimes somebody will have a different title and I'm like, well, I think that's a CFO is what that is. They just call it something different. I think part of that comes from, assumptions of like CFO is more like a corporate role, which you have that background. You definitely have that experience, and you know what transfers over and what's important from a large business to also what are just helpful tools and what may be different or nuanced for church leaders. So what I thought we'd do today is really kind of craft, not in a succinct, specific way, but the big rocks or big elements when it comes to the role of a CFO.
Well, I don't know if you saw me chuckle there when you said the job description, and I was like, well, therein lies the problem right there.
Exactly.
There's our basic problem. Because we go back to when I was in the marketplace and I was CFO of a large division of a publicly held company. So the CFO was my role. The vice president of finance reported to me, and the controller reported to the VP of finance. So those are three distinctly separate roles inside the organization. And that's what I think is what gets missed inside of churches is they want to call someone a CFO that looks more like a VP of finance or even a controller. And that's not a criticism. I'm just saying there are distinctions between those. What I knew was, I was never that, despite the fact that I was a certified public accountant, Frank, I was never that great with debits and credits. There were lots of people who were better at that than I was. Now, I wasn't dumb. I mean, you don't pass the exam without knowing something, but that wasn't my expertise.
Yeah.
And so that was not my responsibility. I grew out of that role, a long time ago. It's like, there's a lot of people here better than that than I am. But what I had was this bigger picture focus, right? So the role of a CFO, if we had to really put it into what I think would be a classic definition, is the CFO is the financial architect of the organization. What I knew was my job was not to look at the day-to-day results. I had a VP of finance and a controller who were focused on that. My job was to look down the road at where the organization was trying to go and make sure that our financial position was appropriate to where we were trying to go. And that's exactly what it would be in a church.
I think that's important, and I want us to unpack that, but I want to ask you one question that I think affects a lot of our audience. Can you be or can you have a CFO who also operates as the controller or VP of finance based on necessity? Maybe they don't have that much headroom in the organization to have that many layers of accounting, or the gifting's so different that that's hard to reconcile. And so oftentimes maybe a church says this one person is doing these 3 roles, but based on giftings and skill sets, it's probably unlikely. And so they're leaning one way, and there's a gap in the organization. So it's kind of 2 questions.
Great question there. I would say you could do that.
Okay.
It wouldn't be what I would do, but you could do that. I think it's challenging to make that work. And here's why. The CFO needs to be someone who is kind of above the forest and out of the trees. And the more you immerse yourself into day-to-day, the harder it is to see down the road. There are some people who can do it. There aren't many.
Yeah.
Now, what I would opt for, which I think would be a better solution there, would be to outsource and have a fractional CFO, which you could probably afford even if you weren't a larger church. That's probably the right way to do it.
Yeah.
Because that person is not involved in the day-to-day. They're not in the trees. They're above the forest, and they can see things and probably help you with things that you're not seeing, particularly if you're using a CFO who's seen other organizations, right?
Yeah.
And that's just down the road for a second. You know that my viewpoint on even bookkeeping in a church is until you get at least to $3 million. I know this is a conversation about CFO, but I want to talk about bookkeeping for a second. Until you get to at least 3, probably even $5 million, you are better off outsourcing your financial function to one of these companies that does it for a lot of churches. Why? They know it better than you do.
Yeah.
And it's probably, I'm not going to say it's less. It won't be more expensive than the person you're hired that you're paying right now. That person could be well qualified, but you know how many churches they know? One.
Yours.
They know yours.
Yeah.
And so what you do is you end up getting benchmarking, and they can say, hey, pastor, when we've seen this metric in other churches that we keep the books for, it's been a little bit of a warning sign for something that's coming, and you don't know that if you're the only one there. So that is my paid advertisement for outsourcing financial bookkeeping up until about 3 or 5 minutes. There's some great organizations out there. I don't want to call one because there's several.
Yeah.
And they're all good and they're all reputable. Do your homework, but that would be that. Now, the other piece to that too is, so you could have a CFO and you're outsourcing all of your bookkeeping. That's really kind of why I was getting that. So you could reverse it.
Yeah.
So you could do all of your bookkeeping in-house, outsource the CFO piece, or you could have an in-house CFO and outsource the financial piece. The main thing is you've got to have somebody who's the big picture who remains objective.
So if you're listening to this podcast, I would encourage you either during this podcast right now, go pull it up on your computer, or after you listen to this podcast, make a few notes. Go get the job description that you currently have inside your church for whoever it is that you would say takes the lead on the finances in your church, outside of the finance committee, who's the point person. And let's see how that reconciles with some of the things that Jim shares today, to see where there may be a gap. Either it's being done, but it's not documented, or it was never asked of them to do. And we realized that really nobody's got those things in their responsibility or are comfortable managing the things that you're going to highlight today.
Yeah. Here's one of the things I want to say up front too, Frank, because I don't know where it's going to fit into the conversation, but we just need to say this up front because I think it does help the perspective here. It's not my job, so I don't speak into it. Okay, when I get hired to help them with generosity and giving, but I do have a financial background and I do know what I'm looking at.
Yep.
And they haven't, and if they ask me, I'll say something, but if they don't, I don't. Here's what I do know. I have seen a lot of churches, I would say way too many churches, that when I hear the pastor articulate his vision for the future and I look at their financial situation, their current financial architecture, the balance sheet and the P&L, I'm not saying they can't get there, but I was just like, that's going to be challenging. They're not in position to do what the pastor actually thinks he can accomplish that God wants to do in and through that church. That's the challenge I'm talking about. That's the thing that I was responsible for in the organization that I was in as CFO.
Yeah.
Was not to make sure the books were closed out every month. That was not my job.
Right.
I had people on my staff who did that. My job was, hey, Jim, if we undertake this initiative next year, would we have the cash and or the financial capacity to take this on without punishing something else that we're trying to do?
Yeah.
And if I said, no, sir, he'd say, well, what would it take for us to get there?
Yeah.
And I would have to explain. That's the role of a CFO.
That's so good.
And that's what the main thing I want to get out here on the front side is that the CFO is like a financial visionary in a lot of ways, and a financial architect who looks at the architecture, the P&L, the structure of the balance sheet today, whether it be the cash position, whether it be the mortgage position. Notice that I said mortgage and not debt because everything I see in a local church is attached to buildings as collateral. That makes it a mortgage, not unsecured debt. I know that may be a small thing, but it's a big thing. But make sure that all of that is in place so you can do what you actually think God is calling you to do in and through the organization.
So where in the CFO world or where in the church world do we see a lack of CFO presence as a problem? So you highlighted that this is the financial architect. They're living at a high level, but on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, where is that role showing up tactically, practically? What meetings are they in? What are they making sure is happening in order to get there to support the vision? So where is that showing up? Because what I'm trying to do is help church leaders find where it's missing, where nobody's doing that right now. And we can say at a high level, we got it, and they approved the budget, and we've got a great elder board or whatever it may be, and they're helping support and help build the financial strategy. But at the end of the day, what are those warning signs or indicators on a weekly or monthly basis that we're missing this role? What things aren't happening if you don't have a CFO?
I think it shows itself up in two places primarily. You know, obviously for us, a lot of what we do at Generis is we get involved with churches when they're doing building projects and or campus improvements. And it shows up there because way too many churches are trying to take on a project that's bigger than what they should be taking on at the current time. And there's nobody there to press back and say, hey guys, maybe we need to step back here.
Financial capacity.
Our financial capacity is not consistent with what we're about to take on. And maybe even looking past that down the road to the project after that, especially in a growing church environment. So what do I mean by that? I would say if you're in a rapidly growing church and you're considering building improvements of some kind, I'd be careful not to put too much leverage, too much mortgage on a building, because the chances are good you're going to need that leverage later on.
Yeah.
And nobody's thinking about that. So if you're in your, let's just say you're a church plant, you've outgrown your first building, you're now taking on your second building. The temptation would be to take on too much building, put too much mortgage on that, because that second building is actually going to cause your up into the right to go even further. You have a surge. I mean, that's why you're building the building, right? And then you come to this third building you need, and now what happens is, the thing about growing churches is you're going to have to build it before you can fully fund it.
Yeah.
That's just the nature of it. Now, at some point you can fund it, but you can't fund it today. So you come to that third building and you're now not able to take it on at all because your leverage, you don't have enough leverage, you can't raise enough money inside your church, and you don't have enough cash. And a CFO who actually understands positioning your church long term could probably see some of that and call you on it early on. Second place I see it showing up is in staffing conversations. So there are way too many churches that have not stepped back and really thought objectively about their staffing situation. I'm going to give you my guess. I think a lot of churches could take 10 to 15% of their staff, not some. There's some that, rapidly growing churches and everybody's overworked.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot of them. They could take 10 to 15% of their staff and no one would notice the difference. Mm-hmm. And a CFO has the objectivity to say, hey, can we take a look at this and the implications it has for down the road? Some of that is in headcount. Mm-hmm. Some of that is in staffing costs as a percentage of our income. You and I know that that's a really, and there's not a right or wrong answer to that necessarily, because a lot of it depends on what model of ministry you've chosen. Mm-hmm. Is it simple church, mm-hmm. or is it something a lot more intentional than that, right? And so that has something to, and what happens is, here's where I'm going with all this, is they don't then put those two together and think about the implications of what that looks like when you're doing it on a day-to-day basis. And a church ends up with 52% of its income allocated to salaries, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And maybe ends up with 34% of its income allocated to buildings, including mortgage. And now you're at 86%. Every month, before you even get one day into the month, 86 cents on the dollar is already committed.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to do effective ministry that way. It's really hard. And so your bookkeeper, your director, those are not the people. Even sometimes your board is not going to step back from it. They're just trying to make sure what's happening keeps on happening.
Yeah.
The CFO is charged with, hey, does all of this even make sense? And can we go further with this? Or do we need to position ourselves a little leaner now so we can go further down the road?
Yeah.
That's a CFO. Those are hard conversations, Frank. They're really hard conversations in a local church, and somebody has to have them. And a lot of times what you're doing is you're managing this balance between what the pastor is seeing and what you can afford to do.
Yeah, so there has to be high trust.
Super high
which
trust.
Makes it tricky to just hire that.
Right.
So just go magically find somebody that's just, this is awesome, and they're going to embrace the vision and trust. And so I see more often than not, I'll say this statement. More often than not, there may have been that role at one time in a church. But when the leadership team gets consistent opposition where they're going, or somebody has to be negative Nancy in the room, kind of raising their hand going, I don't know, guys. I think we need to evaluate this. I support the vision. I just want to make sure we can get there. That when that role or that person retires or transitions, sometimes that role doesn't get replaced because it's not fun to have those conversations. It's not fun to have that person in the room. And so it does have to be somebody that you have very high trust with and that has the ability to frame up and understand where we're trying to go. And they're truly taking a posture of, I'm just trying to help us get there. I just want to make sure we get there correctly. And oftentimes that can become adversarial, intense. And so I think it's one of the reasons that sometimes the role gets lumped together with more of a doer role in the financial aspect and or another aspect in the church altogether, is because, okay, now they have multiple things to do. They can't just focus on why or why not we can do our next step or our next step in the vision.
Yeah. So I had the guy, when I was in the marketplace, the guy that was nicknamed Dr. No in our organization, he was on my team. He wasn't on the executive team. He was on my team.
Yeah.
And so nobody in the organization, hardly anyone in the organization heard his voice. They sort of knew that's who he was, but they didn't hear his voice. I heard him in the staff meeting with our financial team.
Yes.
And I knew how to filter that and how much of that needed to go upline, because, part of what you have to do is you have to be a check and balance.
Right.
So but you got to know when to play that card. Mm-hmm. And the thing that gets you credibility as a CFO is if you only are playing the check card, I'm trying to hold you back every now and then, now you have credibility because you're letting most of what's trying to happen go through the gate. You're like, yeah. And of course it goes into into the axiom. Some battles are just not worth fighting, and that's true for a CFO as well. Some of these things are smaller issues that you don't need to worry about one way or the other. The bigger issues, you got to flag those things, man. Your balance sheet, Pastor. If you're talking about doing that 3 years from now, it's 2025, and you're trying to do that by 2028. I've got a roadmap to get there, but it's not 2028. It's 2030. So you're talking about two years difference from one. That's what we're talking about here is strategy, strategic, long-term placement of the organization so that the financial function can walk hand in hand with the pastor and his vision that God's given him. Right? Does that make sense? I mean, because that's where I think a lot of people miss that.
I agree.
And if you
completely.
can't have it internal, you can definitely find that external in a fractional CFO.
Yeah. And you got to find the right person there
Right
too.
person.
So somebody that you trust their advice and their perspective and their wisdom, and they've been there before and they really understand it. So I think that's super critical. Let me ask you this. When it comes to budget season,
Ooh.
what role does the CFO play with other parties and people involved in trying to figure it all out?
Well, probably one role is to have a striped shirt and a whistle.
Yeah, that's it. Be the referee.
I have to referee a few matches every now and then.
That's
I had to do that some, right? But I think the CFO's role is not so much to get into the details of it, but to look at the whole thing and how it comes together and make sure that all of the parts make sense.
Yeah.
I would say, for me, Frank, one of the things that we didn't have a regular rhythm of it. If I had to go back and do it every 5 years, I would start with a zero-based budget.
Yeah.
Just make you come to me. You don't get, if your budget last year was $600,000, you don't get 10% more this year.
Right.
You got to go back and strip it down to zero and give me item by item, line by line, everything that you need and justify every one of those. It's amazing what a great exercise that is, because there are some things that you've been doing that you realize either A, I can stop doing that and do something else, or I can just stop doing that and I can cut my budget and still do what I've been doing and do more, right? And so I think that's where a CFO is just kind of the directional leader to kind of provide some oversight, some kind of a third set of eyes. What I would do typically on the budget when I was in the marketplace, I wouldn't even look at the first two passes that much.
Yeah.
I would just for sure. I was just very high level. But then by the time we got to the third iteration, I'm a little bit more in there. It's like, hey, tell me what this means.
Yeah.
Tell me why this number. Why did this go up? Why did this go down? But just to back off and with a set of eyes say, based on where our pastor thinks God wants this church to go, is this the kind of budget that we can maintain for this year and beyond and keep moving in the right direction?
That's great.
And that's not the director of finance, and that's not the controller or bookkeeper.
That's so good. So good. What about budget assumptions? So revenue projections, other kind of key assumptions around growth and planning. Where does the CFO role show up in figuring out, what am I building a budget for? I'm a ministry department. I'm the next gen pastor and I'm over kids and students, and you're asking me to build a budget, maybe zero based, maybe it's that year, maybe it's not, but I've got to build a budget. Well, I need some assumptions and a framework to go off of. Are those formed by the CFO, the executive leadership team with the CFO's input? Where do those come from?
So I could see, I think either one of those models could work. I like the idea of the CFO sitting with the executive leadership team and then interpreting that back to the finance team who probably drive the project. That's the way we typically did it. Yeah. I sat with the executive leadership team at the company, and my job was to interpret what I heard them saying, go back to our team and help them start building a budget and give them the assumptions. Here's where I think we're going to go. I actually, one of the things that I learned back then was that we had 3 budgets. We had a high, low, middle.
Yeah.
So we had, hey, worst possible case, best possible case, and most likely. Most likely was the one that we generally presented to our leadership team. But if they started saying what if, and the what if had an up to it or what if had a down to it, we were like, oh, well, here's that one right there.
Yeah.
Right? So it always had sort of a, hey, if things went really well and we hit every marker, it looked like this. If we missed every marker, it might look like this. Now, by the way, no one would have had a forecast for 2020.
Right.
Because no one would have said in fourth quarter of 2019, hey, do you think we ought to budget for a worldwide pandemic sometime next year? So there are things that come and happen all of a sudden that you couldn't have budgeted for. Most of the time, you can anticipate what's going to come. So I think either one of those, and depending on the way your organization works, one or the other could work. But the main thing is the CFO becomes the interpreter for how the driving assumptions play into the budget. If I wanted to say, hey, Frank, so, based on what the pastor is talking about for next year, we're going to need to take outreach up by 30% next year. That would be a budget assumption that you wouldn't know about, but I would know about that because I sat in an executive leadership team and we've got to fund that. We can't assume that we're going to do 30% more with the same amount of money. Sure. We've got to factor that into our financial plan.
That's great. What about who calls for reforecasts? What do you think about reforecasts in the church and reevaluating things? You're laughing. I'm kind of laughing.
I'm laughing.
What's going on?
I've got a lot of PTSD on that.
Tell me more about it. Tell me more.
All right. So
Struck
we
a nerve,
were
folks.
just now starting to use financial spreadsheets in the late 80s and early 90s. Do you remember Lotus 1, 2, 3? Yeah, that was what we were using, the whole Lotus setup.
Yeah, I was using that. I was 5.
Yeah.
I was 5. Yeah, but that's a different point. But yes, I am familiar with that. It was on my
So
personal computer.
that's what we were doing back then. And the thing about we had one of our guys, he was our president. He was fanatical about reforecasts and would do them all the time to the point that they lost meaning. So a little bit of the point is too much reforecasting is not a good thing.
Yeah.
It's not a good thing. But there are times when I think a reforecast is called for. I think it can happen from the board. I think it can happen from the senior pastor. I think it can happen from the CFO.
Okay.
And any one of those three could call for that. Now, what would be one of the ways, one of the things that, and we've talked about this in a separate episode when we talked about some of the bookkeeping things that I would do that a lot of people don't do. The one thing, and this was kind of a culture thing in our organization, but it was a great tool, and I still love that tool. And in fact, you've seen it inside of our organization. If we have a budget, I like to see a whole separate financial presentation that has actual numbers for the months that we've completed and forecasted numbers for the remainder of the year. And that will tell you as much as anything whether you need to reforecast. The other thing is that I would always have a rolling 12 months. Your rolling 12 months is going to tell you more than your year over year. Your year over year tells you certain things, but the rolling 12 months will give you your current. And then even better than that is to have a rolling 6 months. So here's what happened over 12 months, but does the near-term trend look better or worse than that?
Yeah.
I looked at a church in Mortarstone just the other day. Their 12-month trend is positive. Their 6-month trend is minus 14%.
Wow.
On giving.
Wow.
And nobody saw that until I pulled it. In fact, I didn't know it.
So it was lost in the 12 months?
It was lost in the 12 months. So the previous 6 months are so good that it overshadowed the minus 14% that's actually sitting there.
Wow.
And that's just, I'm not the CFO, but again, my objectivity and just kind of thinking, what's happening here? And I just, boom, stumbled on it. That's the kind of thing that you want to see, and that could call for a reforecast, right? Yeah. So now that you're looking at your most recent 6 months is not as healthy as your last 12 months, why is that? Well, they began to understand, okay, here's why I think that's happening.
Yeah.
And they don't see that changing for another 3 to 6 months.
Yeah.
So that would be a reason to reforecast.
I think that this is one of those areas about experience with CFO, just background experience and needing that role. I was looking over some financials for an organization right before Christmas, so a few months ago. Mm-hmm. And when I sat down and was looking over the financials, I was staring at a spreadsheet. It wasn't Lotus, but I was staring at a spreadsheet. It was printed out, and all the math was right. The math was mathing. The numbers worked. Something wasn't right, and I was staring at it. I didn't know what it was yet, but I was looking at it going, no, there's something here. I don't know what it is yet. Something's not right. And so the guy that's presenting, I'm just listening, and the whole room is engaging, and they're going line by line. And I'm just looking at the spreadsheet going, I know it's off. I just don't know where. And once again, the math was mathing. The numbers added up. And what I realized, very similar to what you just said, was in their 12 months or 10 months of actuals from last year that they had on this spreadsheet, there was something radically changing in 4 months that was being distorted by 6 months. Okay. The exact same thing that you're referring to.
Yeah.
And because of the way it was in small print, all lumped together, everybody missed it. Everybody in the room missed it. It was just rocking and rolling. And yet our trend was going the wrong direction on that. But it was looking at it, and there's a part of that CFO gear that exists in some people. And so this is where you may need that fractional CFO, or you've got to have that person that they can look at the exact same thing you look at and catch something that you may have missed. Once again, even if the math works, we're not discussing if accounting is being done correctly, but they can see things even when they're not called out because they have that gear and talent. So to your point, it just resonated with me because I saw the same thing just recently. Yeah. Without you in the room in that setting, I assume that I wasn't there, they would have missed that truth and discovered it later, but made decisions without that information in that moment, even though it was right there on the sheet, staring them in the eyes. Yeah. They all knew, all had access to that information. It just didn't pop out. It hadn't been called out. That CFO has a gear to be able to do a couple things. They kind of play chess with math is the way I like to say it. They're thinking a few moves ahead. So they're going, I hear what you're saying, but I think you've actually double counted that income or whatever, because I'm pretty sure we said it was going to cover this and this. It's not on the spreadsheet yet, but you see and you hear those things. You kind of catch those things. And then the other thing is they can just see a spreadsheet and know just by staring at it that something is not right, even though all the math works, and they have that gear to be able to dig in to figure that out, which could be a game changer when people are making large decisions about buildings and staffing and where to go in ministry, that they wish they would have had that information that oftentimes gets missed without a CFO.
Yeah, there is a natural curiosity that a CFO has to have of trying to understand, I see what this is, but what does it mean for us, right? And, there's a couple of things that really have influenced me on this, and they kind of show up in similar places, but sort of different. One of them is that, again, I don't get paid to be their financial advisor. Mm-hmm. But as I take on a client, or if I'm just speaking for a church who's inquiring about our services, a lot of times I've seen their financial statements, not the giving data, but their financial statements.
Yeah.
And I'll ask the XP or the senior pastor, hey, how do you feel about the financial condition of your church right now? Oh, we're in great shape. And the bubble above my head is like, you're 3 Sundays away from broke.
Yeah.
I mean, if you miss 3 Sundays by weather or something happened, I don't know how you'd fund payroll. Mm-hmm. And they're looking at that, and I'm just like, that's off. That's off. Now, I know that they're not just deceived. They just don't know better. Mm-hmm. And that's where a CFO would help them to see, hey, pastor, it's not wrong for us to have 6, 8, 10 weeks of reserves so that we can make it through a rainy day if that happens. That's not a bad thing. That's mm-hmm. not hoarding. Mm-hmm. I think there is an accumulation that is hoarding, but that's not it. And so I see these financial statements. The second thing is, and this happened to me for a number of years, and I just decided to take a different posture. For a long time, I'd sit in these rooms, Frank, and I'm sitting and I'm having preliminary conversations with churches about building projects and potentially capital campaigns. And I'm looking at their cash position. I'm looking at their current mortgage. I'm looking at how much I think they're likely to raise in a capital campaign type giving initiative and the cost of their project, and it doesn't add up. And I'm sitting there and it's off. And it's obviously off.
Yeah.
And there's nobody in that room that knows it.
Yeah.
And so what I would do, I still do kind of the same thing, just do it a little different. What I would do is I would walk up there and I'd write the numbers and I was like, guys, y'all can't afford this building.
Yeah.
And you know what was happening? I'd get out of the room and they'd go build that building mm-hmm. and then regret it.
Yeah.
Because it was too big and they took mm-hmm. on too much mortgage.
Yeah.
Right? And what I realized was they didn't own that decision. I could see it. Mm-hmm. but I was just some other opinion.
Yeah.
I was just that's your opinion, Jim.
Yeah.
And when you went, your opinion left the room,
Yeah.
and we went and did what we were planning to do anyway. So then I started doing something different. I started going up to the whiteboard. This is not actually hard for me to do, and play dumb. And I would just like, hey, there's a lot of numbers flying around in here. I'd like to just get these on the chart just so we can all look at them together. And I didn't say a word. And the first couple of times I did it, someone in the room, either a staff person like the executive pastor or one of the lay persons said, hey, pastor, I'm just wondering, can we really afford this building?
Yeah.
And the bubble above my head is saying, no.
No. Glad you asked the question.
No.
Right?
I didn't say anything.
Yeah.
And that's when it worked.
That's interesting.
That's when it worked. Because now they own that decision. So what I was doing was using my CFO perspective in that room, and instead of telling them something, I let them discover something.
That's so
And
good.
they stopped. And most of the churches where I've done that, they stopped and paused and reevaluated whether that was the right thing to do or not.
Yeah.
I love that. And that's what we're really saying about the role as a CFO. Your role is to see down the road and help the church make good decisions today that allow your church to thrive and flourish in view of the vision and the mission that God's put in front of you in and through your pastor. That's what we're talking about here.
That is so good. That's so good. I hope as you've listened to the podcast today that you feel the weight that somebody needs to be filling this role inside your church. It's a missing piece. If you're a growing church that's younger, or you've been established for years and years and years, you're trying to figure out what's next. It's just not a role that typically is just bolted on. That you got to build a committee, and a committee creates a CFO. Very much like a committee doesn't create a senior pastor. There's a gap. There's a skill set that's reconciling vision with where we're at and where we're going. That has an ability that's really unique. And so I would encourage the leaders on this podcast today not to get confused that a CFO and the person that handles accounting and doing the tasks, that's not the same thing. And so we've tried to bring some light to that today to be really helpful. Is there anything else that you want to bring clarity to for this role of CFO that hopefully could kind of help people be compelled to want to make sure this role is filled in their church?
I think I would just go back and just say, this is the person who's going to be, if the pastor is seeing God's vision for the church, this is the person who's seeing the financial vision for the church. How do we come alongside that vision and make it happen?
Yeah.
And it needs to be someone who's got an objective viewpoint with some financial expertise that can step back and say, does this stuff even make sense in view of where we're trying to go?
Yeah.
And just be right next to the pastor, hand in hand, arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder, and say, I think this is where we need to go with that. I think if you do it right, Frank, it'll be one of the greatest blessings you've had in your organization.
That's huge, Jim. I love that. I would add one other that's just kind of hit me. It is not uncommon if you are a growing church, maybe a church plant that's a handful of years old, or you've grown beyond that, and now you have multiple campuses or whatever it may be, for this role to be one that outgrows the person that was in it early on. What's required when we're making six-figure decisions on things, and what's required when you're making 7- and 8-figure decisions on things, it's just different. And so I'm not saying you should fire anybody. I was trying to say you're flipping your world upside down. Maybe they grow with the role, but as I've seen churches that have grown, it seems to be a role that I've seen multiple times where the role has outgrown the capacity of the person that was in there for a season when their church was just in a very different place.
Yeah.
So just be aware of that. So just because you may have somebody that has that title or you view them in that way, the other thing to evaluate is are they the CFO for this season? Or what else can we do to equip them? And it may be something that's not that they're not the role. They get the vision. They have high trust. They're great. But maybe there's a new round, a new level of equipping that needs to be done to help them grow as the churches grow.
And Frank, I think that's it's true in this. It's true in almost any role in the church, frankly.
That's fair.
And that is, I use kind of a farming analogy to describe it. You know, the guy who can farm 25 acres can't necessarily farm 1,000 acres.
Yeah.
And it's not that he doesn't have the ability to farm. Both of them know how to do farming. It's a capacity thing.
Yeah.
So pay attention to that, especially if you're growing, and make sure that the capacity of the person matches the scale of the organization at that point in time.
This has been fantastic, Jim. Thank you so much for your wisdom.
And we'll do it again when?
Next Sunday.
Next Sunday. Next Sunday.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.